evening, everyone, and welcome to Half-Life and Your Life, part of the National Hemophilia Foundation's Make Your Move Physical Therapy webinar series. This new series is supported by a cooperative agreement from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Our presenter this evening is Debbie Voss. Debbie, PT, DPT, ATC, CSCS, has been a physical therapist for over 20 years and has worked in the bleeding disorder community since 2006. While a physical therapist at the Hemophilia Center of Western Pennsylvania, she was actively involved in Camp Hot to Clot, the Western Pennsylvania camp for children affected by bleeding. In addition to being a licensed physical therapist, she is also a certified athletic trainer and holds certification as a strength and conditioning specialist. Welcome, Debbie Voss. Our program will conclude with a question and answer segment. To ask a question, go to the area in the far lower left of your webinar screen and type your question into the field just to the left of the send button, which is located in the pod or area labeled chat. Click the send button when you have finished typing your question. However, please note that your question will be addressed during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. The PowerPoint presentation is available as a handout. Please go to the Handouts tab located on the left side of your screen to download. However, a recording of this event will be available shortly on the National Hemophilia Foundation website at www.hemophilia.org. For more information and to view the video from this presentation, please be sure to visit stepsforliving.hemophilia.org. Without further ado, I will now turn things over to Debbie Voss. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone joining in tonight as we discuss clotting factor half-life. I really appreciate you taking the time during this, I'm sure, busy holiday time to maybe learn something new about factor half-life or reinforce some of what you may already know about factor half-life. So our objectives for tonight are first and foremost simply to define what clotting factor half-life is, to go over and understand how half-life relates to prophylactic factor infusions, to talk about the best times to infuse factors for an individual based upon their activity level. And then we're going to do a little bit of math, but I promise that it won't get too bad. We're going to calculate some factor levels based upon half-life. Early on in this presentation, I wanted to share with you a half-life video that was developed by the NHF. You may or may not have already seen it. It's been out there for a little bit, but it's full of some great information about clotting factor and in particular half-life. So we're going to go through that video next, and then the rest of the presentation is going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the information that was present within that video. I just want to make you aware also with this video, if you want to take a look at it later, it is available on YouTube. So if you simply go to YouTube and search for the title, Making Your Clotting Factor Work for You, it is available there to be seen.
Making your clotting factor work for you. Sophia and her son John both have bleeding disorders. Even though they have bleeding disorders, they live normal and active lives. Sophia works and likes to go to the gym. John goes to school and plays on a soccer team. To protect themselves from bleeds, Sophia and John follow a treatment schedule called Profi. Profi is short for prophylaxis. This is when you take clotting factor infusions on a regular basis, such as every other day, to prevent a bleed. These infusions provide the clotting protein called clotting factor that their bodies are not able to make. The clotting factor helps protect them from bleeding. Once the clotting factor is infused, their bodies use it up over time, leaving factor levels lower as time passes. One aspect of how clotting factor works is called half-life. Half-life is the time that it takes for the body to use up half of the clotting factor. For every half-life that passes, the amount of clotting factor in their body is reduced by half. For example, if John's clotting factor product has a half-life of 12 hours, and John infuses to 100% on Monday at 8 a.m., then 12 hours later at 8 p.m., how much clotting factor is left in his body? Only half of the clotting factor will be left in his body. Another 12 hours later at 8 a.m. on Tuesday, how much clotting factor will be in his body? Only half of the amount from 8 p.m. will be left in his body. This leaves John with 1/4 of the initial amount infused 24 hours before. The half-life of Sophia's and John's clotting factor plays a role in when they infuse. Sophia and John use different clotting factor therapies. They have different lifestyles. They participate in different activities. Sophia goes to the gym on different days than John plays soccer. Because of all of these differences, they have different infusion schedules. Their infusion schedules have been personalized for them with their healthcare team. They infuse at different times on different days. This provides them protection when they need it most. It is important for Sophia and John to have clotting factor in their bodies at all times. This helps protect them against spontaneous bleeds. Spontaneous bleeds are bleeds that happen without an obvious cause. However, during physical activities such as working out, heavy yard work, or playing sports, high levels of clotting factor are needed. You should perform high-level activities when factor levels are at their highest just after infusing to protect against bleeds. If John has soccer practice on Wednesdays, he should infuse before practice on Wednesday. If Sophia wants to go to the gym, she should infuse before she goes to the gym. Other activities like doing work at a desk, reading, studying, or sleeping do not require as much clotting factor. These are not risky activities. They can be done longer after infusing clotting factor or closer to the next scheduled infusion. This is why it is often not recommended to infuse right before bed, since it will be a long time before the body is active again. Infusion schedules should allow you to participate in higher risk activities when your clotting factor levels are high. It is important to remember the amount of clotting factor in the body is based on time, not activity. This means that if Sophia goes to the gym after an infusion, she does not use up her clotting factor at a faster rate because she is being more active. Her clotting factor is used up as time passes, not because of the activity she is doing. The amount of clotting factor decreases by half after 1 half-life, no matter what Sophia does after she infuses. Half-life is also important to think about during a bleed, too. John got a bad spontaneous bleed in his knee and needed to infuse before the next infusion on his Profi schedule. There are some reasons that clotting factor may be used up more quickly in the body, such as a bad bleed, infections, or surgery. So always check with your healthcare team. It may be necessary to infuse more often. Just like John and Sophia, it is important to work with your healthcare team to find the best infusion schedule for you. There are many clotting factor products available. They have different half-lives. Everyone's body eliminates clotting factors differently. Working with your healthcare team can help you decide the best days and times for your infusions based on all of your activities during a week. You should also work with your healthcare team if you have bleeds, even though you have been following your Profi schedule. They may run tests to better understand your clotting factor half-life, adjust your schedule, or assess for other potential complications. For more information on half-life, treatment, and staying active, visit stepsforliving.hemophilia.org.
All right, so a lot of really good information in that video. And just to kind of hit the high point of the presentation again, clotting factor half-life is simply defined as the time it takes for the activity level of the infused factor in your body just to decrease by 1/2. So we looked at in the video a way to represent the way that the factor decreases over time by sort of that circle that gradually decreased as time went by, particularly when you were looking at John's half-life of his factor. There are different ways to think about factor half-life within the body, and I've just shown some other ways here in this next slide by using both a chart and also a graph. So if we start at the top here with this chart, what you see are two different columns. The first one that's talking about time from the factor infusion, and then it also shows the amount of factor remaining in the body. And the particular example for this slide that we're showing assumes that there is a 12-hour half-life of the factor. So if you see on the first line it says time 0, or when the factor is first infused, it's infused to a 100% level. So after one half-life or 12 hours, that will have dropped by half down to 50. After another half-life, or 24 hours from the initial infusion, it will have dropped by half from the previous time down to 25%, and so on. So for each half-life, the amount of factor within the body will drop by half. The graph sitting below it is, again, just another way to visualize what factor levels are like in the body. And when your providers might do some testing or try to figure out your particular half-life for a factor product, they may actually draw a graph like this to try to understand it. So if we look at along the time, that's looking at hours away from the factor infusion, and then up along the side is showing the factor level in the body. So at the factor infusion, it's taking it up to 100%, and then after one half-life or 12 hours, it's going to drop down to 50%, and so on. All of these points on the graph show the factor levels in the body at different times when the blood is drawn. And typically, a factor half-life graph is going to look like this curved line that sort of starts high on one end and then gradually drops off. And there are other examples of this graph within the presentation, so I think that it's a nice way to kind of understand how the factor changes in the body over time. So why do we care about half-life? Why is it so important? Part of it is really important to understand that there are times after you infuse factor that not only are you more protected against having a bleed, but there are also times when you may be less protected the farther away that you get from that factor infusion. And we know that the greater the factor levels within the body, the greater the protection you have against bleeding. So this will allow you to plan some of your factor infusions so that you can have some of the highest levels during those very physically active times, like when you do sports or exercise. The video mentioned Profi, or prophylaxis, which is a regular infusion of clotting factor to prevent bleeding. It's taking factor before there is a bleed to try to prevent it from happening. And it's also looking at your factor half-life to figure out what your schedule needs to be for your Profi in order to keep factor levels high enough in the body to try to prevent bleeding from daily activities and then also from your extra activities like sports and exercise. All right, so we're going to get everybody involved in this. This takes a little bit of thought and a little bit of response. We're going to start with our first polling question, and then you're going to have a chance to submit your answers, and then we're going to go over the correct answer. So for this first question, the goal of Profi is to keep factor levels in the body high enough to prevent A, spontaneous bleeding, B, bleeding during an activity, C, bleeding during a procedure, or D, all of the above. Now we're going to give some time for people to submit their answers, and then we're going to go over this. Again, the goal of Profi is to keep factor levels in the body high enough to prevent A, spontaneous bleeding, B, bleeding during an activity, C, bleeding during a procedure, or D, all of the above. Seeing some good responses come in. All right, and it looks like we have all of the responses in, and the correct answer for this is 100% of the respondents said the correct answer D, which is all of the above. So when we're talking about prophylaxis and keeping those factor levels high enough, we want to protect against those spontaneous bleeds, those that happen without an obvious cause, right? Can just sort of happen and nobody really understands why they develop just in daily activities. We also want to protect against that bleeding during an activity sports and exercise, or if you're going to an amusement park or having a more high-level activity. Bleeding during a procedure, which may mean a surgical procedure or a dental procedure, we want to make sure that those factor levels are high enough to protect against that type of bleeding also. So great job. Everybody got that with D, all of the above. We know that in order to determine an appropriate Profi schedule for an individual, it really depends upon that individual's half-life to that particular clotting factor. Understanding that the factor half-life will change over time, and where it starts high and kind of drops low, you know when another infusion should be required when the factor level drops to that critical period or a low period when bleeding is more likely. And that way the timing of the factor infusions can best be determined to keep you active doing the things that you want to do and not have to slow down and treat bleeds. As I had mentioned with the other half-life graph, this is sort of a graph that looks like what a typical Profi program might look like for somebody. In this particular example, this is someone who is on a standard factor 8 Profi program, and they infuse factor 3 times a week. So what you see with this, each time you see one of these peaks that happens, that means that's when factor is infused. And then you see that gradual drop-off that happens as the body uses up some of the factor, and then it means it's time for another infusion, and then again that gradual drop-off. And this continues on a regular basis. If you look at the color coding from this graph, the green area means that that's a time when there is really good protection from factor. The factor levels are high, and that can provide the best protection during more active times like sports and exercise. If you start to look into the yellow area, that means the factor levels are still pretty high and it provides some good protection along those times. But when we start to get down into this orangish area, that's when the factor levels are getting pretty low, which means it's probably time for another factor infusion to try to raise up those levels again. So again, this graph just kind of shows visually what we expect the factor level to look like in the body over time when taking regular factor infusions. All right, time for another poll. This one you have a 50-50 shot at, so I think everybody's going to do great on this one, just like the last one. For this one, it's a true or false. True or false, the replacement clotting factor 8 and factor 9 have the same half-life. A for true or B for false. And everybody can go ahead and submit their answers to that one. And we'll leave just a little bit more time for submitting answers. All right, it looks like all of the answers are in. And for this one, 100% of you said the correct answer B, which is false. So we know that different clotting factors have different half-lives. When we look at some of the standard factor 8 products and the standard factor 9 products, it's commonly understood that typical factor 8 products have a half-life somewhere between 8 and 12 hours, and standard factor 9 clotting factors typically have a half-life somewhere between 18 and 24 hours. Again, this is sort of a standard that most people start with, but recognize that some of the half-life can vary from person to person. In the last few years, you probably have heard about some of the newer products that have come out that are called prolonged half-life clotting factor. And what that means is they tend to stay in the body longer than some of these standard products do because they're designed to not be used up by the body quite as quickly. But the half-life of some of those prolonged products really vary based upon the product and then also upon the individual. You may have heard about or even had something that's called a PK test. And PK simply stands for pharmacokinetic test. And this is actually a lab test that your doctor might order to find out what your particular half-life is for a given product. And the way that these are administered is you are infused factor at a certain time period, and then over a matter of hours and sometimes days, blood draws are taken, and that blood sample is sent to the lab with wanting the lab to check to see what the factor level is at that particular time. And when your provider then has that information of the factor levels at different time periods, they can look at what your half-life is, kind of like we looked at some of those graphs earlier, to know how your body uses a particular product and what your half-life is. not everybody has probably had a PK test. Maybe not everybody even needs one. That's a discussion that you and your provider can have. But some reasons that your provider may recommend that you get a PK test are when you're switching a product. So you know on that new product exactly what your half-life is. If you get breakthrough bleeding, so sometimes you might be on a regular Profi program and you're taking your factor infusions the way that it's been scheduled and everything's going well for a time, and then all of a sudden for some reason you're getting some breakthrough bleeding that you didn't have before and you don't know quite what to do with that. Make sure that you let your healthcare team know that, because your doctor may want to take a look at some of your PK tests and see what's happening within that factor level within the body to see if maybe a change needs to happen to your Profi schedule. And then finally, another reason why PK tests might be ordered is before a surgical procedure. Some surgeries and even some dental procedures typically can be associated with quite a bit of blood loss, not only for someone who has a bleeding disorder, but just someone in the general population as well. And the doctor probably wants to have a really good idea of how your body responds to factor and how quickly it uses it up before you get into one of those situations where you might be at increased risk for bleeding, because they want to control any excess bleeding with that. So just like it talked about John and Sophia, when to infuse factor is a very individualized decision based upon your exercise and activity level. It's important to have the highest factor levels during the most active time of the day. Again, if there are particular sports exercises or activities where you're going to be doing a lot more activity where you think the risk for a bleed might be higher, it's important to have higher factor levels during that time. That might mean right before sports practices, sports competitions. For some people, if they don't have a regular regimented exercise program, it may just mean infusing first thing in the day, because just going about their normal activities is their most active part of the day. So infusing in the morning before they get started helps to protect them during their daily activities. Just like it showed for John, infusing before bed is not recommended. When we're asleep, that's not typically our most active time, and typically there is a low risk of having bleeds from that. It also means, if you think about that graph, if you infuse factor at night and all of a sudden your factor level is at the highest while you're sleeping, by the next morning when you wake up, factor levels have dropped quite a bit within your body, and you'll have a lower level then as you get on with your day and start doing activities. I pulled in sort of a copy of a blank calendar here. And this is something that can really be helpful before you go in to meet with your doctor or your healthcare team, to actually fill out a calendar just like they had in the video and say, these are the days that I expect to exercise or that I have certain sports competitions. These are the things that I'm involved in. And take that into the provider, and they can use that information along with knowing what factor product you're using and what your half-life is, and figure out a good plan to help to protect you. We want to try to prevent these bleeds from happening, because when bleeds happen, you have to take the time away from your activity until that bleed fully resolves. And if we can prevent those bleeds on the front end, that keeps you involved in sports and exercise, doing the things that you love and the things that can help to keep you healthy. The one thing that I do want to mention with this is, this calendar may change from season to season. If you're playing sports for one particular season and then you don't play for a few more months after that, you may need to touch base with your healthcare team and just say, do we need to have a change in this Profi program? Do we need to think about different activities and different ways to do Profi? So keeping in a very close relationship with your team and working with them as a team to share the information can help to determine the best plan for you. All right, so now we get into a little bit of math. And again, I promised it won't be bad. A lot of this is based upon similar examples to what you saw in the video. But for this first example, we're going to talk about Ned. And Ned infuses a factor IX product, which for him has a half-life of 24 hours. Ned has a desk job, and he walks each morning for exercise. And what we want to try to figure out is, if Ned infuses factor to a 100% level at 6 a.m. on Tuesday, what is his factor level at 6 a.m. on Saturday? And we're going to use just this chart like we had used before. So we know here again, Ned factor IX clotting factor with a 24-hour half-life. Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. he infuses to a 100% level. So after one half-life, or Wednesday at 6 a.m., it will have dropped by half, down to 50%. Another half-life, Thursday at 6 a.m., it will have dropped down to 25%. Friday at 6 a.m., another half-life down to 12.5%. And then finally, the question that was asked, what will his factor level be Saturday morning at 6 a.m.? It will be just over 6%. So this one gets a little bit trickier, and it will actually allow you to take a look at the information and to submit your answer for this one. So in this one, we're looking at Evan. And Evan infuses a Factor 8 product that has a half-life for him of 10 hours. Remember when we said in the previous slide that standard Factor 8 typically has a half-life somewhere between 8 and 12 hours? Well, maybe Evan had a PK study for whatever reason, and he knows that the half-life of the Factor product that he is using is 10 hours in his body. Evan happens to like to play basketball, and he has a weekend tournament coming up. So if he infuses so that he has a factor level of 100% just before his 8 a.m. game on Saturday, we want to try to find out what his factor level will be at the end of the tournament at 2 p.m. on Sunday. So again, this is 30 hours later from the start to the beginning of the tournament. And the options are, and we're going to start the next poll, will his factor level be A, 75%, B, 25%, C, 12.5%, or D, less than 1%. And if you just kind of take a look at this, you don't necessarily have to sit there and figure it all out. You can just kind of go, it looks like it might be close to this one. And again, we'll go over this in more detail. All right, and I see people submitting answers. That's good. All right, I think we're looking good. All right, and it looks like the survey has closed for this one. And what we are going to look at with this one, I'm going to tell you the percentages that people answered first, and then we're going to go through it. So no one said 75%. 20% of the participants said the factor level would be 25%. 80% of the participants thought that the factor level would be 12.5%, and no one said less than 1%. So let's take a look at this. Again, using the chart here, Evan infuses his Factor 8, which has a 10-hour half-life. Saturday morning at the start of the tournament, he has a 100% factor level. After 10 hours, or one of his half-lives, that drops down to 50%. Sunday at 4 a.m., which is another half-life, it's dropped down to 25. And then finally, at the end of his basketball tournament on Sunday at 2 p.m., it will have dropped down to 12.5%. So that was the correct answer, C, 12.5%. Very nice job. All right, so summing it all up, the things that I hope that you can take away from this is understanding the importance of clotting factor half-life information, what your particular half-life is for a product, and what that means related to how you plan your activities and how you plan your factor infusions. As a physical therapist, I want you to exercise. I want everybody to exercise and be healthy, choosing the right kind of activities for you. But it's also important to coordinate those factor infusions with your activity level to try to minimize the chance of developing bleeds. And please work with your healthcare team. That's what they're there to help you with. Go in and say, these are the things that I participate in. These are the days that I do it. How can I best design my Profi factor infusion schedule to help me to keep active in these things that are important to me? And work together with a team with them to come up with that. Thank you very much again for logging in tonight and participating in the polls and all of your attentiveness. I think that we are going to go ahead and move on to some questions. So Annette, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Ladies and gentlemen, to ask a question via the web presentation, please select the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen, then type and send your question. If you would like to ask a question live via the phone, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. I will announce each caller prior to bringing you into the conference. Please remember, if you have your phone on mute, take it off mute when you are selected to ask your question. Once again, to ask a question via the web presentation, select the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen, then type and send your question. To ask a live question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. Debbie will just pause a moment for any questions. Thank you, Debbie. Our first question, why do plasma products have longer half-lives than recombinant, or do they?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to sort of back up and talk about this from a physical therapy standpoint. So some of the specific pharmacokinetics of different factor products are not something that I tend to deal with on a daily basis. However, I think if there are questions related to this and or you've used plasma products versus recombinant products, having that discussion with your healthcare provider who may be prescribing that particular medication is a good question to ask there. Because, you know, if you want to look at maybe having a factor product which has the longer half-life, which may mean, you know, fewer infusions over time, then that comes into the whole idea of that conversation to say, you know, what's a good choice for me? These are the things that I want to do. These are my options. I want to make sure that I am protected against having bleeds. But regarding specific products, whether they are plasma-based, recombinant, or even some of the longer-acting prolonged half-life, those are specific questions to bring up with your provider so he or she can address what would work best for you as an individual.
Excellent. Thank you, Debbie. We have no further questions. Thank you to Debbie for presenting today. Your feedback is critically important to us, not only in evaluating this presentation, but in planning future webinars. Please complete the 5-minute survey that will be displayed on your screen. You can click the link to enter into the survey. Your feedback is important to us. Thank you for attending. This concludes the program.